A Family Friend is the latest foster care memoir from Casey Watson, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but I will discuss this in two parts. I will kind of discuss very vaguely what I think of it and share some basic thoughts, and then I'll go into a tiny bit more detail if you want to know what the main theme is. Maybe you can work it out given the title, but I want to first of all give zero spoilers, and then I'll tell you what's actually happening in the book, but without giving any major spoilers for ultimately what's happening. And this is about a 13-year-old boy called Sammy, who's been in care for quite a while. He used to live with his grandmother, and then his grandmother passed away, so he went into the foster system, and he's now staying with Casey. And there's a bit of a mystery because something happened with Sammy and the son of his previous foster carers, and we don't quite know what that is to begin with. And to be honest, I'd actually forgotten about that part of it until it comes up again. And Sammy seems like a really nice person. He's really likable. He's really into fashion. He is obsessed with his mobile phone, which in itself is maybe not the most peculiar thing, but it does play an important role in the story. And I'll say no more than that about the specifics, other than the story has something to do with Uncle Kenny, the next door neighbour when Sammy lived with his grandmother. And I'll go into a bit more detail about that in a moment. And the first half of the book, no, maybe the first third, I won't say quite the first half, it was fine. It was a little slow. I wasn't really finding it that interesting. And then once things start to get established and we find out more about what's happening, it gets a lot more interesting. And I'd say the second half, I just flew through it. Usually I do with foster care memoirs, but with the first third of this, I wasn't really engaged in it. I wasn't really that interested. And I was a bit concerned that this one just wouldn't be a decent story. I say story because it's based on truth, but we do have some aspects changed to protect the identity of the child in question, which is always the case with foster care memoirs and always completely understandable. But once it got going, it really picked up. So thankfully, I did ultimately find it to be a really fascinating read. In terms of the writing, it's fine. There are some very waffly, long-winded sentences. That's not unique to this one. That's quite common with Casey Watson books. Sentences can have about 1,000 commas in them, and it's really irritating, but not enough to affect the overall enjoyment. A few small grammatical issues here and there, but again, nothing that would turn me away from the book, which is saying something because I'm quite easily turned off of books. If the grammar's even a little bit poor, I can't deal with it. So thankfully that's not the case here, but just a few things here and there that a good edit could solve, nothing major. And yeah, maybe the pacing was a little slow to begin with. It took a while to kind of get anywhere. But once we got there, it was a really great read. Sammy is a very likable character, which I think is really important for getting behind the story. Emotionally, I think he was very well written. And I think that works really well. So in general, I have no complaints. I think A Family Friend is well written. Obviously, heartbreaking to think that this story is based on truth, and I'll talk more about that in a second with a spoiler warning. And if you're a foster care memoir fan and you haven't read this, then I definitely recommend checking it out. If you're new to foster care memoirs, this could be a good place to start. I do recommend reading them chronologically, especially with Casey Watson. I just think following the journey chronologically of the foster carer is quite interesting. But if you wanted to start here for whatever reason, I'd say it's a good place to start because it's not the most horrific story. It's bad, but it's not impossible to read. There are some like that, but it's also not the tamest either. So I think it's a nice middle ground. And ultimately, if you're interested in it, I'd say check it out. I will now talk a little bit about, well, I'll tell you what's happening and what the problem is and who Uncle Kenny is, but I won't say ultimately what happens by the end of the book. So I'll establish the themes, but I won't give away the ending. And basically, Uncle Kenny is the next door neighbour. And I have to say, I worked out what was going on to some extent pretty quickly. And this is because at the beginning of the book, we find out that Sammy orders a lot of things online, clothing, shoes, things like that. And Casey asked him where this money comes from, and he kind of brushes her off and just says he gets money for birthdays and Christmases, and his Uncle Kenny sends him birthday money and things. But that must be a lot of birthday money to be able to continuously afford these purchases throughout the year. And I kind of realised then that Uncle Kenny was not an honest individual, and it basically turns out that he's paying Sammy to send explicit images of the underage boy. And I won't go into any more detail about that, but that's the main theme of the book. And I think that it's a really eye-opening look at how clever some people can be with pulling young people in and making them feel like they're special and loved, and getting them to open up, and well, ultimately sending them inappropriate images. And obviously, even though I feel like young children are taught from a very young age, don't do this, don't give people your personal information, and certainly don't send them images, I feel like when people start love bombing them and, well, grooming them, it's going to be much harder for children, or anybody, I guess, but certainly in this case, for Sammy to resist, bearing in mind he'd lost his nan, he doesn't really have anybody else in his life, and his Uncle Kenny, the next door neighbour, is basically all he has left. And it's a really heartbreaking story, and I'll say no more than that. I feel like it is very eye-opening. Anybody with young children, or children of any age, I think could learn from this about ways that certain people operate, and just raising awareness for the dangers of online. And anything that does that, I think, is doing great work. And I think it does a really great job of that. And it shows a lot of the emotional turmoil that Sammy faces. So in general, a well-written story, definitely very valuable. And as I said, it's probably a good foster carer memoir to start with if you are new to the books. And ultimately, A Family Friend is not a bad read at all.